The yellow lights blinked in the dark. There were 40 of them, spread across 600 kilometers of open space. Each one was the size of a ground vehicle. Each one carried a simple transmitter. Each one broadcast the same message in 47 languages, on a loop, every 30 seconds, without pause, without change, without apology. You are entering Terran space. Turn back now. You will not be warned again. Ambassador Quas of the Galactic League had read that message 11 times since his observation ship took its position 3 hours ago. He was here to document. His orders from the League Council were simple. Observe, record, do not interfere. The League had received word that the Vorthkai Empire was moving a fleet toward the Terran border. The League wanted eyes on whatever happened next. Quas had those eyes. He pressed them against his sensor feed and tried to count the ships. 200, maybe more. They moved in tight formation, a wall of gray metal pushing through the dark, slow and certain. The Vorthkai did not rush when they expanded. They had done this before. 14 times in 200 years they had pushed a fleet into the territory of a smaller civilization and absorbed what was there. They were efficient. They were patient. They were completely sure of themselves. Quas watched the lead ship reach the first buoy. The buoy blinked yellow. It broadcast its message. The lead ship did not slow down. It passed through the buoy field without a single course correction, and 200 ships followed it through, and the buoys blinked and spoke and were ignored. High Admiral Droon stood at the center of his command deck and watched his fleet cross into what his maps labeled as unclaimed fringe space. His intelligence reports described scattered human colonies, light defensive infrastructure, and no standing military fleet in the region. The humans had placed those buoys themselves. His analysts had studied them and called them a display of emotion rather than capability. Species that could actually defend territory did not need signs. They simply defended it. Droon agreed with his analysts. He had 41 years of expansion campaigns behind him. Every species he had ever faced had either fought from the front or run. None of them had ever made him slow down with a blinking light. He did not slow down now. Aboard Border Station Oris, positioned at the inner edge of the outer reach, Sira Voss watched the sensor board and said nothing for a long time. The station was not large. It held a crew of 12, a communications array, a command room, and a direct link to the Terran Border Authority grid. Sira had worked this post for 3 years. She had seen probe ships cross the buoy line before. Small ones, usually. Scouts from curious species who pulled back the moment she broadcast a follow-up warning. This was not a scout. She counted the drive signatures on her board and stopped counting at 180 because the number stopped mattering at that point. She walked to the far end of the room where Rael Dorn was reviewing a maintenance log, and she set her hand on the table next to him without saying anything. He looked up. She tilted her head toward her board. He stood and walked over and looked at the sensor feed for about 4 seconds. Then he picked up the long-range comm and contacted Director Holt at the Colonial Authority. The channel opened immediately. Holt was already awake, already watching her own feeds. The conversation lasted less than a minute. Rael asked for authorization. Holt gave it. No speeches, no declarations of war. One word, spoken in the same flat tone a person might use to confirm a supply order. Protocol. Rael set the comm down and looked at Sira. They crossed the line, he said. Sira nodded and turned back to her board. She entered a 12-digit authorization code. The system accepted it. A light on the board that had been dark for 6 years turned green. Rael looked at Otto Grund, who was sitting at the far station eating something from a container. Otto looked back at him. Rael said, "Grid is live." Otto set his container down and rolled his chair to his console. That was all. On the observation ship, Quas was still watching the Vorthkai fleet advance when his sensor board registered something strange. The buoys had gone quiet, not destroyed, not moved. They simply stopped transmitting, all 40 of them at the same moment, as if something had decided the message no longer needed to be said. He flagged it in his recording and added a personal note. The Terran warning buoy ceased broadcast the moment the Vorthkai fleet completed its crossing of the border threshold. Reason unknown. I have seen border systems shut down when overwhelmed. I have also seen them shut down when they were no longer needed. I do not yet know which of those two things I am looking at. He paused and looked out at the space ahead of the fleet. It looked completely empty. He had spent enough years doing this work to know that empty space and safe space were not always the same thing, but the Vorthkai fleet did not seem to share that understanding. They were still moving, still in formation, still certain. The yellow lights were dark. The message was done. Something else was beginning. The first probe drone the Vorthkai sent into the dark ahead of the fleet was a standard scout model. It had a camera, a signal relay, and a collision sensor. It was the kind of machine that had performed 10,000 advanced sweeps across 10,000 sectors without a single loss. It traveled 4 kilometers ahead of the fleet, broadcasting back a clean feed of empty space. Then it stopped broadcasting. No explosion, no distress signal, no last image. It was simply there, and then it was not there, and the feed was replaced by static, and Sub-Commander Yale noted the loss in her incident log and sent a second drone. The second drone traveled 3 kilometers before it stopped broadcasting. She sent a third. It made 2 kilometers. Yale set down her stylus and stared at the numbers. The drones were not being shot. There were no weapon signatures, no projectile tracks, no energy bursts on the sensors. The drones were disappearing cleanly, the way a signal disappears when something absorbs it rather than destroys it. She brought the findings to High Admiral Droon. He looked at the log for a moment, then told her it was a sensor malfunction and ordered the fleet to continue. She went back to her station and said nothing, but she began running a quiet background calculation on fleet escape vectors, which was not something she was supposed to be doing yet. On the observation ship, Quas was pulling every piece of public data he had access to on Terran border doctrine. He found almost nothing. A few old treaty references. A navigation advisory from 30 years ago telling civilian ships to avoid the Outer Reach Transit Corridor. One academic paper from a League scholar who had tried to map Terran defensive philosophy and concluded only that the humans seemed to prefer building things in advance rather than responding to threats as they arose. The scholar had called it a cultural quirk. Quas was starting to think it was something else. Aboard Oris, Sira Voss was explaining to Quas's observation ship what she was permitted to explain, which was not very much. She had received his formal information request 20 minutes after the fleet crossed the line. She answered it with the standard Terran Border Authority public statement. The Outer Reach was Terran sovereign territory. The warning buoys had been placed in accordance with galactic boundary law, and any vessels in the region did so at their own risk. Quas had written back asking what their own risk meant specifically. Sira had showed Rail the message. Rail had read it, set it down, and said, "Tell him he'll see." Sira sent that exact response. She later admitted it was probably not the most diplomatic answer she could have given. What Quas did not know, and what Droon did not know, and what almost no one outside the colonial authority knew, was what 60 years of quiet preparation looked like from the inside. Rail Dorn had not built the Outer Reach defense system. His predecessor had not built it either. It had been started by the first generation of colonists who settled the border worlds, people who had come from a planet with a long memory of what happened when you left your door unlocked. They had petitioned the colonial authority not for a standing army, but for something older and more patient. A trap. A landscape that would do the work so people did not have to. The construction had taken decades. It had never been announced. It had never appeared in any military budget under its real name. It was listed in colonial authority records as regional infrastructure development, outer sectors, and no one who read those records had ever asked a follow-up question. What it actually was, 40,000 autonomous drone units distributed across 600 cubic kilometers of space, currently in low-power sleep mode. 18 gravity anchor platforms buried inside asteroids, each one capable of creating a localized mass shadow that would pull a ship off its course without any visible cause. A rail network mounted on the dark side of debris fields, preloaded and pre-aimed using star charts that had been calculated and updated every year for 6 decades. And threaded through all of it, a quantum-linked command net that bound every piece into one single organism, waiting for a signal. The signal had arrived 4 minutes ago, when Sierra entered her authorization code. The system was awake. It was watching the fleet. It was making its own calculations. Rail had been told by the officer who trained him that his job was simple. The system ran itself. It had been taught to run itself. His job was only to give it permission and to be present while it worked, so that the decision to use it would always be a human one, made by a person, and not a machine acting alone. He had given it permission. Now he was present. He sat in his chair in the command room of Horus and watched the status board and finished his meal, while the grid mapped 200 Vorthkai warships and began to think about what to do with them. On the Vorthkai fleet, a 4th probe drone disappeared. Then a 5th. Droon called it equipment failure and told Yale to prepare the forward cannons. Yale prepared the forward cannons. She also quietly finished her escape vector calculations and saved them to a personal file she labeled Administrative Notes. The dark ahead of the fleet looked exactly the same as it had always looked. That was the part that should have worried them. The battle did not start with a shot. It started with a ship turning left when it had been told to go straight. The Vorthkai cruiser Relentless was in the 4th column of the fleet formation when its navigation system received a signal it interpreted as a course correction from the Admiral's command ship. The signal looked exactly like every other command signal the fleet used. It carried the right encryption pattern, the right frequency, the right timing. The Relentless turned left as instructed. It turned directly into the path of the cruiser behind it. The collision was not catastrophic. Both ships had strong hulls, but both ships lost engine control for 90 seconds while their systems ran damage checks, and in those 90 seconds they drifted 400 meters out of formation, and the formation had to split around them, and the clean wall of 200 ships became something slightly less clean. On the Vorthkai command ship, Droon demanded to know who had issued an unauthorized course correction. No one had. His communications team checked the signal log and could not find the source. The signal had come from inside the fleet's own frequency range, but from no ship in the fleet. Yale noted it in her log and said nothing aloud. Then the second thing happened. The cruiser Hammer of Vorth, positioned at the left edge of the formation, reported that its engines were working correctly, but the ship was not moving in the direction the engines were pointing. Something was pulling it sideways by a fraction of a degree every few seconds. Not enough to trigger an alarm, just enough to bend its course slowly toward the debris field on the port side of the fleet's path. The navigation officer corrected. The pull came back. She corrected again. It came back again. Slowly, quietly, the Hammer of Vorth began to arc away from the fleet. Then the rail slugs arrived. They did not come from ahead of the fleet. They came from the side, from a direction the fleet's sensors had mapped as empty debris field, traveling at a speed that made them almost invisible on approach. They were not large. Each one was roughly the size of a human arm. At the velocity they were traveling, they did not need to be large. The first salvo punched through the engine section of a destroyer on the right flank. No explosion, no fire in vacuum. Just a row of clean holes through the rear of the ship, and the destroyer went dark and began to drift. The fleet opened fire on the debris field. They fired for 6 minutes. They hit rocks and ice. They did not hit anything that fired back, because the rail platforms had already cycled to their next pre-calculated position, and the shots were coming from a different angle now. Ambassador Quas was watching everything from outside the boundary of the engagement zone. He had moved his ship back another 50 kilometers when the first collision happened. He was shaking, but his recording was running and his notes were precise. He described what he saw this way in his log. The Vorthkai fleet is fighting a location. It is pouring weapons fire into space and hitting nothing. I have observed no Terran vessel of any kind. I have observed no crew. I have observed no command ship giving orders to whatever is operating out there. The fleet is being taken apart by something that does not appear to be there. Inside Oris, Sira Voss was reading the combat feed off the grid's own sensors, which were far sharper than anything the Vorthkai fleet was carrying. She had a precise count. In the first 40 minutes of engagement, the grid had disabled or destroyed 31 ships. It had done this using 17 rail platform firings, 2 gravity anchor activations, 4 swarms of drones that had assembled from 6 different directions, and punched through engine housings, with the focused patience of something that had been waiting in the dark for a very long time, and 1 additional signal spoof that had caused 3 ships to fire on each other's flanks for about 90 seconds before their commanders sorted out what was happening. The grid had not used 40% of its available assets. It was, by Rail's assessment, being somewhat conservative. Otto Grund had made 2 manual adjustments in 40 minutes. He had redirected 1 drone swarm slightly to avoid a ship that was already disabled and no longer a threat. He had delayed a rail firing by 8 seconds because a piece of debris from an earlier strike was drifting through the calculated impact corridor. Both adjustments had taken him less than 15 seconds each. The rest of the time he sat at his console and watched the board. Rail had finished his meal and was now reading the after-action data as it came in. He read the way a person reads a weather report, factual, calm, occasionally nodding. On the Vorthkai command ship, Droon was not calm. He had lost 31 ships. He had not seen a single enemy. His weapons teams could not find a target that stayed in one place long enough to lock on. His navigation officers were fighting ghost signals and gravity pulls simultaneously. His communication with the rear of his fleet was degrading because something was intercepting and delaying relay signals by fractions of a second, not enough to block them, but enough to make formation coordination increasingly difficult. He gave the order to reverse course and exit the way they had entered. On Oris, Sira watched the fleet begin its turn. She looked at Rail. They're trying to pull back. Rail looked at the board, where the rear of the fleet's retreat path was already mapped by the grid. The path they were turning toward had been mined for 60 years. I know, he said. Rail Dorn opened a broadband channel to the Vorthkai fleet. He did not prepare what he was going to say. He had thought about this moment before, not often, but enough to know that a long speech would be the wrong thing. Droon was a military commander. Military commanders who had just lost 41 ships in 40 minutes did not need a speech. They needed a sentence they could act on. Rail spoke in standard Galactic, which the fleet's translation systems would handle automatically. This is Border Commander Rail Dorn of the Terran Colonial Authority speaking from Border Station Oris. You entered Terran space without permission. You were warned. In the past 43 minutes, you have lost 41 vessels and approximately 9,000 personnel. We have lost nothing because we have no crew deployed in the field. Every system you have been engaging is automated. You cannot destroy it by shooting at it. You cannot run from it because the path you are now turning toward is also covered. I am offering you 1 exit corridor. I will transmit the coordinates now. The corridor will open in 10 minutes and remain open for 20. After that, the grid resumes normal operation and the corridor closes. I will not reopen it. He transmitted the corridor coordinates and closed the channel. On the Vorthkai command ship, the bridge was silent for a long moment. Droon stared at the coordinates on his screen. Then he opened his own channel and began to speak loudly, in a way that made clear he intended his words to be recorded and played back at a later tribunal of some kind. He called the human action illegal under Galactic Expansion Convention. He called the automated systems a violation of civilized warfare. He called Rael Dorn a coward for not sending actual ships and actual soldiers into the fight. He was mid-sentence when Envoy Prith, the Imperial political officer, reached over and physically removed the comm unit from Droon's hand. Droon turned to look at him. Prith was not a large person. He was thin, older, with ink-stained fingers and a reading tablet that never left his side. He had been on 17 expansion campaigns. He had a habit of sitting in the back of the room during battles and taking notes. He was not taking notes now. "Admiral," Prith said quietly, "we need to take the corridor." Droon told him he did not take orders from political officers. Prith looked at the loss count on the board. 41 ships. He looked at the timer running on Rael's 10-minute countdown. He looked at Sub-Commander Yale, who was standing very still and saying nothing, but whose hands, Prith noticed, were resting on her console in a way that suggested she was very ready to do something the moment someone gave her permission. "This is not a battle," Prith said. "This is a demonstration. We are the demonstration. If you fire that comm back up and keep talking, you will be on record as the admiral who delivered 200 ships to the Terrans and gave them an excuse to destroy all of them instead of only 41. If you take the corridor, you will be on record as the admiral who made a tactical withdrawal in the face of an unknown weapons system. The second record is survivable. The first one is not." Droon was quiet. Yale said without looking at either of them, "The corridor coordinates check clean, sir. No grid signatures along the path. It appears to be genuine." That was all she said. She did not recommend anything. She simply gave information. Droon sat down in his command chair. He looked at the timer. 7 minutes left. On the observation ship, Quas had received the audio of Rael's transmission because it had gone out on broadband and his ship systems had captured it automatically. He played it back twice. Then he sat for a while and did nothing. He had heard commanders give speeches before battle. He had heard them give demands, ultimatums, declarations. He had never heard one speak the way Rael Dorn had just spoken. No anger, no triumph, no performance. The man had sounded like someone reading out a schedule, calm in the way that people are calm when they are not afraid, and not afraid in the way that people are not afraid when they have already accepted the worst possible outcome and arranged for it not to happen. Quas added a note to his recording. "The Terran commander's offer of an exit corridor is the most significant detail of this engagement so far. He did not have to do that. The system was operational. The retreat path was covered. He could have closed the engagement completely and lost nothing in the process. He chose not to. I do not yet know if this is doctrine or policy or something personal to this specific man. I intend to find out." On the Vorthkai command ship, Droon gave the order 3 minutes before the corridor closed. He said it quietly. He did not repeat it. He looked straight ahead when he said it, and he did not look at Prith or Yale or anyone else. "Take the corridor." Yale had the fleet moving in 40 seconds. On Oris, the grid tracked the retreat, confirmed the fleet was using the correct path, and held its fire as the ships moved through in broken formation. Otto Grund watched the board. He did not touch his console. The grid did not need any help letting people leave. Rael watched the last ship exit the corridor and cross back over the buoy line. Sierra checked the final count. She put it on the main board without saying anything. Rael read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Send a full report to Holt. Medical teams to any disabled ships still inside the boundary. Standard recovery protocol." Sierra looked at him. "Recovery for their crews." "Yes," Rael said. "Their ships got hit. Some of those crews are alive in there. We go get them." Sierra sent the order. Outside in the outer reach, The grid was already guiding 3 automated recovery drones toward the drifting hulls of the disabled Vorthkai vessels. The same system that had put them there was now going out to collect the survivors. It did not know the difference between those two instructions. It simply followed them both. Rail thought that was probably the most human thing about the whole arrangement. The first thing Envoy Prith did when the fleet cleared the Terran border was write his report. He did not wait to reach Imperial space. He did not wait for Droon to file his version first. He drafted it on his reading tablet in his bunk while the fleet was still making its way back through the fringe corridor, and he transmitted it to the Imperial Senate on a direct line that bypassed the Admiral's communication authority entirely. He had that authority. Political officers always did. It was one of the reasons admirals hated them. Prith's report was 4 pages. It was factual and quiet, and it did not spare anyone, including himself. He wrote that the fleet had entered Terran space after receiving a clear warning in 47 languages. He wrote that no intelligence report had accurately described the scope of the Terran border defense system. He wrote that the system had operated for the entire engagement without a single Terran crew member in the field. He wrote that the Terrans had offered an exit corridor and had honored it completely. And he wrote, in the final paragraph, that the colonial authority had also dispatched automated recovery ships to collect surviving Vorthkai personnel from disabled vessels inside the border, and that those personnel were being processed and would be returned through diplomatic channels. He underlined that last part. Then he put his tablet down and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The Imperial Senate received his report 11 hours before Droon's official after-action filing. By the time Droon's version arrived, the Senate had already read Prith's. The political conversation had already begun without the Admiral in it, which was, Prith suspected, exactly how Droon's career would end. He felt no satisfaction about that. He mostly felt tired. In the Galactic League's central chamber, Ambassador Quas delivered his field report in person because the Council had specifically requested his physical presence. He stood at the speaker's platform and read from his notes in a level voice, and the chamber was very quiet. He reported 41 Vorthkai ships destroyed or disabled. He reported 0 Terran losses. He reported the duration of the engagement as 43 minutes from first contact to corridor offer. He showed the sensor data. He showed the communication logs. He played the recording of Rail Dorn's broadband transmission so the Council could hear it in its original form. When the recording ended, no one spoke for a moment. Then the representative from the Orin Collective asked if Quas had been able to identify the location of the Terran command center that had operated the defense grid. Quas said yes. He had tracked the transmissions back to their origin. The representative asked what kind of installation it was. Quas said it was a border monitoring station with a crew of 12. The chamber was quiet again. The Orin representative asked Quas to repeat that. He repeated it, 12 crew, 1 station, 200 Vorthkai ships. Across the chamber, representatives from 11 different species began pulling up their own navigation charts. They were checking, Quas understood, where their own borders touched Terran space. They were thinking about what might be sleeping under those sectors. They were asking themselves the question that Quas had been asking himself since the moment the buoys went dark. What else did the humans build in places we never thought to look? He did not have an answer for them. He was not sure the Terrans would give one if asked. On Earth, Director Holt was sitting in a small office in the Colonial Authority building when a journalist reached her through a cleared media channel and asked for a comment on the Outer Reach engagement. Holt had been awake for 31 hours. She had a ceramic cup of something warm on her desk and a stack of recovery reports in front of her. The Vorthkai survivors were being processed. All 114 of them had been pulled from disabled ships alive. Some were injured. Terran medical teams were treating them. The plan was to return them through neutral league channels within the week. The journalist asked Holt what message she wanted to send to other civilizations following the engagement. Holt thought about it for a few seconds. "We put up signs," she said. "That's all we ever wanted to do. We put up signs and we asked to be left alone. If someone ignores the signs, then the outer reach answers for us. But we're not interested in war. We're not interested in trophies. We're going to send those people home." She looked at the recovery reports on her desk. "We already started." The journalist asked if the colonial authority planned to expand the outer reach defense system. Holt said she could not discuss infrastructure details. The journalist asked if the Terrans were concerned about retaliation from the Vorthkai Empire. Holt said she could not speak for the Empire, but she noted that the Empire now had a very detailed record of what the last attempt had cost, and that she expected rational actors to consult that record before making decisions. 3 days later, a small message arrived at the colonial authority through League diplomatic channels. It was from the Felari, a species whose colony ships had been traveling for 4 years looking for a settled location near the Oran Collective. The message was politely worded and somewhat nervous in tone. It asked, in careful standard Galactic, whether the Terran colonial authority would be willing to extend territorial protection to a Felori colony ship convoy, while the convoy passed through a region adjacent to Terran border space. The Felori explained that they were not asking to settle in Terran space. They simply felt that moving near it, at this particular moment in galactic history, seemed like the safest available option. Holt read the message and approved it the same afternoon. She sent back a route plan and a contact frequency for Border Station Oris, with a note that Commander Dorn's crew would track the convoy and respond to any distress signal within the border-adjacent zone. She also told her aide to send the Felori convoy a standard Terran navigation package, which included, among other things, the location of every warning buoy in the outer reach. Old habit, she always made sure guests knew where the signs were. Quas came to Oris 6 weeks after the engagement. He had requested an interview through formal channels and had expected to wait months. The response came back in 4 days. Commander Dorn would see him. The station was accessible via standard docking approach on the outer ring. He was welcome to bring recording equipment. Quas arrived with a small case and one assistant. The docking approach was exactly as described. The outer ring of Oris was old and had been repaired in places with materials that did not quite match the original hull. The corridors inside were clean but not decorated. There were no plaques, no commemorative displays, no record of the engagement marked on any wall he could see. He had expected at least something, a date, a number, a line of text. There was nothing. Dorn met him in a small room off the main corridor that served as something between an office and a storage area. There was a desk, 2 chairs, and a shelf with binders on it. A status board on the wall was cycling through sensor feeds of the outer reach in real time. The space outside looked exactly as empty as it had always looked. Quas set up his recorder, and they talked for 2 hours. He asked about the system first, in general terms, because he knew Dorn would not give him technical specifics. Dorn confirmed the system was automated, that it had been built over decades, and that it was maintained on a regular schedule the same way any infrastructure was maintained. He said this without any drama, the way a person might describe road upkeep. Quas asked how many people on Oris had been actively involved in the engagement. Dorn said 3, himself Sira Voss and Otto Grund. Quas asked what the other 9 crew members had been doing. Dorn thought about it. Rond was fixing a water filter in the lower bay. I think Pell was sleeping. We work in shifts. It was early for some of them. Quas wrote that down. He asked about the recovery operation. 114 Vorthkai survivors had been pulled from disabled ships and returned through League channels. Quas had spoken to 3 of them in a follow-up visit. All three had described the same experience. They had been drifting in damaged ships, expecting to die, when automated recovery vehicles arrived and guided them to pressurized compartments where basic medical equipment was already running. None of them had seen a human being until they reached leg-neutral territory. Quas asked Dorn, whose idea the recovery operation had been. Mine, Dorn said. Quas asked why. Dorn looked at him as though the question was slightly strange. Their ships got hit. Some of their people were alive. We have recovery systems. That's what recovery systems are for. Quas asked if he had ever considered that recovering enemy survivors was unusual. Dorn said, I don't think of them as enemy survivors. I think of them as people who were in damaged ships. The situation that put them there was over. The situation they were in after that was just a rescue problem. Quas moved on. He asked if Dorn had felt anything watching the engagement unfold. 41 ships, 9,000 personnel, the final count had confirmed, though many of those were the ones his own recovery teams later brought home. Dorn was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, just thinking. Yes, he said. I felt bad that they didn't turn around when they had the chance. I really thought they would. We give a long window. 10 minutes is a long time when you're in a bad position. I thought Droon would use it earlier. Quas asked if he had wanted them to turn around. Of course, Dorn said. If they turn around, no one gets hurt and I go back to doing normal work. That's the preferred outcome. Quas looked at the status board on the wall. The outer reach sensors were cycling through sectors, empty space, debris fields, the occasional automated maintenance drone moving between positions on its scheduled route. He asked the question he had been building toward for the entire interview. Did your people build the outer reach system because you enjoy war? Dorn looked at him in a way that Quas later described in his report as the most genuinely puzzled expression he had seen on a human face. No, Dorn said. We built it because we don't. If we liked war, we'd have gone out there with ships and fought them. We built it so we would never have to do that. Quas closed his recorder an hour later and sat in the small transport that took him back to his ship. He spent most of the flight writing. His hands were steady now, which they had not been during the engagement. He wrote quickly and did not stop to edit. He wrote about Dorn and the two crew members who had managed the whole engagement from a station with a water filter being repaired in the lower bay. He wrote about the recovery operation. He wrote about the Felori convoy, which had passed through the border-adjacent zone the previous week without incident, escorted by grid sensors the whole way. He wrote about the 9 other crew members who had been sleeping or working on maintenance during the largest border defense action in Terran history. He wrote near the end, the Vorthkai Empire has fought 14 wars in 200 years. They understand strength as something you demonstrate by going forward. Humanity has fought no external conflicts in 80 years. They seem to understand strength as something you demonstrate by not having to go anywhere at all. They buried the cost of attacking them in the dark, where no enemy could plan around it, and where no friend would ever need to find it. He paused on the last line for a while. Then he wrote, the Empire was warned. The signs were there. The buoys spoke in 47 languages, and when no one listened, the outer reach answered for them. The stars here look the same as they always have, but the galaxy knows now what is sleeping underneath them. He saved the document and looked out the window at the outer reach. It looked completely empty. He had stopped believing that.